This is the Endo meeting on Wednesday, June 25 of 2025. Chris, you wanted to ask some questions about the compartment mapper's digest step.
Yeah, so I'm working on this thing to try to consume Webpack with our Lava Mode node implementation. And this Webpack invokes some common plugins from the ecosystem, but it also invokes our Webpack plugin. I'm not there yet, but I'm trying to sort out why I'm having these like policy failures. So I run this is what I've been doing. I've been generating policy using the compartment map that was generated by capture from map. And so this compartment map is nicer than the like raw map that comes out of map node modules, which doesn't check if anything is actually used. It just kind of barrels through the whole node modules directory, looking at package JSONs and figuring out what depends on what. And so,
Yeah,
um,
it is like that first step produces more data than you need and also less data than you need. It's the right.
right.
It gives you the skeleton of package JSONs out to the extreme, way beyond what you're likely to use, and has absolutely none of the module details except for those that can be inferred from package JSON, right?
All right. And so, and I feel like this has to do with dynamic require, but so at time, so I generate a policy using this thing, and I've got it. So I'm using the same call to map node modules when we first generate policy, and then the next step when we execute is to make that same call to map node modules, except this time pass the policy we made in. And it seems like I don't know if this is even possible, but it seems like when we get to execution, I keep getting all of these policy enforcement failures. And the code that enforces the policy looks in it looks in the module descriptors for a given compartment descriptor, and it tries to match the thing that was wanted with an entry in the module descriptor map or whatever you call it. And it can't find it. And I'm like, well, why? Why can't it find it? Like if I look at policy, well, it's in policy, but it's not in module descriptors. It's in scopes or whatever, not in module descriptors. And so I I'm kind of I'm a little bit confused. Like, what exactly is digest from map doing? I know it takes there's like it gathers sources together and it like mushes the sources in to apparently build out this the module descriptors, right? But I feel like because of maybe dynamic require, it's not like doing that the right way, and so maybe there's a bug in linking for that. But so what
It,
exactly is it doing, right?
yeah, so the digester is renaming compartments mostly. Most of what it's doing is about renaming compartments so that the incidental details about your file system disappear from uh, from the compartment map.
Yes.
So I can definitely see that having wreaking havoc of some kind on um, on dynamic require, given that dynamic require is usually, if I understand correctly, extremely concerned about the physical locations exactly
Yeah.
they are placed on the file system. So if you're running through the digester, and the bug may simply be that you're using the digester in a case where you shouldn't.
Well, so we're only using the digester during policy generation.
Right, which probably creates a mismatch between,
Yeah.
yeah, it causes your compartment map not to correspond to the keys of your compartment map to no longer correspond to locations on the file system, and
Well, that's not a big deal because we return this mapping of what we renamed, and I can use that to look things up. But it's really just the things that I expected to be in the module descriptor map are just not there.
ah, well, then there might be a bug. It might be that something was collected, and if it was collected, that would be because it had been because we failed to retain it. And if we failed to retain it, that might be because of some missed step in um, introducing the new multiple entry points feature. Like,
Well, yeah, I'm not even working on that.
yeah.
This is previous to that. I'm working off of master right now.
Mhm.
Trying to just make this thing work without using multiple entry points, using a
Oh,
single entry point.
all right.
Theoretically, digest should not be changing the number of items.
Well, number of items in what? The compartments?
Yeah,
Oh, it does.
number of items in general.
The only way for something to stay put during the digest step is if it was flagged as retained, which means it had to be explicitly used somehow. And I feel like that maybe is not getting done in certain situations that I haven't yet determined.
Um, ZB, is your comment based off of the assumption that the digest step is not doing the garbage collection?
No, I think I meant besides the retained field, there is no other reason for things to be dropped. And I made an assumption that things being retained uh, is constant across all the ways we use it. But
Should.
maybe
The
digest is where we check for things being retained, and then if we don't use it in one spot, then
Yes.
we can miss stuff not being retained properly.
Yeah.
the other reason something wouldn't end up there. So if I run map node modules without a policy, and then I run it with a policy that I just generated, like I would I would expect them to be different because essentially I probably missed like adding something to policy overrides, right? Because
There,
it checks every time if we're going to add something to the list of module descriptors, it checks to see if it's allowed first. And if something didn't get in there, it's going to be missing from module descriptors. And maybe that's just the source of the issue is that the the generated policy and I wonder if it even has to do with okay, here we go. So when you're running it with the policy, it says, okay, we're not allowed here, and so we're not gonna like, well, maybe not. I was thinking that it might be possible because we're skipping adding things to module descriptors that the paths change. Um, so I'll have to verify that that's not true. But like definitely there were there was some weirdness with the paths um, that I observed.
Hmm.
I don't know.
there's definitely a place where policy is being consulted while the graph is being processed into a compartment map.
Yes.
And uh, and I don't think it's a good clue because the problem you're reporting is that something that is present in the policy is not present in the compartment map, which could only happen if the policy was misinterpreted to not contain something at the point where we're using the policy to limit what goes into compartment map, which I assume we would have spotted earlier.
Hmm.
And that thing is really simple. It's finding an item in policy and looking up what's allowed. So it would have to be a mismatch of a path
Path, yeah.
between when the policy was generated and when the policy is being applied.
And by path, you mean the dependency name path?
Well, the path
Path,
property
I
of a
need
compartment descriptor.
Yeah,
yeah, the canonical name, the array of
yeah.
the array representing shortest path to the dependency in the dependency tree.
Yeah. But I think I was probably having a problem like breaking down where exactly I should be debugging. And I feel like that is one place where I should verify that things are what I expect them to be. And then if that all looks okay, then I'll start worrying about digest, right? But I feel like, yeah, there's something weird somewhere between the
Yeah,
two.
yeah. The thing that an interest so a direction that I don't have an answer for you. I don't know what's going on, but a direction of inquiry that might be interesting. I do have the compartment map. The digest algorithm predates the existence of paths, the dependency path array. Um, and it's designed to rename things. It's designed to rename packages deterministically, and the generated compartment names are based off of the of the names of the individual packages, with suffixes if it's necessary to disambiguate them. But we could use the path instead. We could create a variation on the digest algorithm that uses the path as the unique identifier for a package within for a compartment, within an archive or bundle or for policy generation or whatever. And that might make the issue you're discovering more transparent, but I'm not sure. I'm also not sure whether it wouldn't have unfortunate side effects. Like the current algorithm uh, tolerates packages moving around. Like the hash of a package won't be disrupted if you do quite so much if you do some if your package manager moves something, like the name of that package will continue to be the same. And those kinds of displacements are expected with the introduction and removal of dev dependencies because of what we consider a bug in the package manager. But
One note on that, digest was adjusted for compatibility with paths and the way entries in compartments are sorted falls back to path if the labels are identical.
And I also, okay, yeah, all right. I mean, this gives me some direction, but there's also a second problem that we've seen before, and ZB, I can't remember why it went away. But we had that issue where we for whatever reason the root compartment was not hitting the attenuator first. What did we do to make that problem disappear? Because I see it now again. Do you remember what I mean? considered sorting it and making a guarantee that the first thing that would be attenuated would be the root compartment. But we didn't. Or did we just
Didn't
simply
we?
forget about that?
Yeah, I need some time to think and look around. But yeah, I recall we addressed this.
Okay, well, I'm seeing it again, so.
We were deciding between keeping it as the first one. Oh, I think we ended up not relying on the order and relying on having a separate attenuator for the root instead. That was one of the options, but I need to go back and see if we ended up guaranteeing anything in there or not.
We didn't. And you know, I have some code that does it now because I had to do it. But yeah, I mean, a separate attenuator for the root is something that we haven't. I remember you mentioning that, but like I didn't implement anything for whatever reason. So we can follow up on that later. But okay.
Okay.
No,
So
that's all I got.
yeah, so suffice it to say you've got your dynamic require needs to operate on physical locations. Your policy needs to be enacted on logical locations. The digest translates from physical to logical, but also creates side tables that you're able to use in the dynamic require case for walking back from if you dynamically require something by its absolute path, you're able to look up through the side
Yes.
table to find the logical location, and that all in theory should work. Okay. So yeah, I don't know, there's not an architectural problem. You probably, I don't know.
I mean, things work when the when the dependency tree is simple. So it's just like these yeah. So it's like I have 1,600 compartments now. So
Mm.
things get kind of hairy, I guess.
And they're not moving around from between the time you generate the policy to the time that you
Right. Right.
policy. Interesting. Maybe there's a collision. There shouldn't be, but if there's a collision, maybe, no, that wouldn't be it. In any case, I think that that's all we can do today.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you.
All right. Let's bring Ryan to the stand.
Here I am at the stand. Uh,
Welcome, Ryan.
thank you.
Ryan, I believe that you had a question about three-party handoff terminology.
That's right. It is a question that, if the answer is simple, I would prefer a simple answer. It is a question of three terms and a request to have them generally distinguished or sorted into some ontology. So the terms are delegation, proxy, and third-party handoff.
Okay, good. The so there's, I think the essential matter is a distinction that I think Alan Karp ended up, or Alan Karp and I together, we arrived at the terminology of introduction by proxying and introduction by shortening. And hold on one moment. Sorry about that. So introduction by shortening is what three-party handoff does. And what that means is that when Alice introduces Bob to Carol, the standard diagram, Bob Bob's connection to Carol does not go back through Alice. It goes directly to Carol. And it's only with shortening that you can also solve the Grant Matcher puzzle. Do you know about Grant Matcher?
No, I don't. I'm not really even sure what word you're saying. Grant Mash.
Grant Matcher, Matcher.
I see. I
Yeah.
don't know one.
So do a search for a Grant Matcher or Grant Matcher puzzle at site:erights.org.
Yes, yes.
Okay. So the and since I'm on my phone right now, can you just go ahead and post that to the Zoom chat so I can have it in front of me as well? Okay, thank you. So hold on. Okay, good. So introduction by proxying is when Alice can talk to Bob and Alice can talk to Carol, and rather than trying to form a direct relationship between Bob and Carol, the way Alice enables Bob to talk to Carol is Alice provides Bob with a proxy, not proxy in the JavaScript sense, just a object that's supposed to act like Carol, and it's just a object running on vat A, Alice's vat, such that when Bob sends messages to it, vat A then the proxy object, the object in vat A, then forwards those messages to Carol. So every introduction also lengthens the chain to get from the recipient back to the introduced object. And Alan's built systems that do introduction by proxying. I've built, my systems generally do introduction by shortening, and that's where the whole three-party handoff thing comes in. Now, delegation is a higher level concept. It's something that you can do by introduction, but I would not use the word delegation to directly speak about introduction. So, every time, one object sends a message to another object with the third object as an argument, it's an introduction. Delegation is more about the purpose of the introduction. So some introductions are delegations and some aren't, depending on the purpose. Delegation is, the English word, which is where we should start, is I'm basically taking something that you might consider to be my job to do, and internal to how I'm doing my job, I might delegate part of the job or the entire job to some other thing to complete the job. And that can and that doesn't even need to involve introduction, actually, now that I'm saying that out loud. So delegation, I think, is a distinct concept. It would certainly not surprise me if overall our literature used delegation in a confusing way. But introduction by proxying, and introduction by shortening, and three-party handoff, all of those should be precise.
That is an excellent answer for me. Thank you.
Okay, great.
A thing.
Oh, I gotta point out, because of the claim otherwise earlier, we actually did dispatch the terminology issue quickly.
I'm, I'm over here off camera eating my words.
But did we really?
In any case, this topic touches on some interesting stuff for user experience for, well, the pet demon or possibly what you're building with pet names. The I discovered a desire while while building out the pet demon. I realized at some point along the way, something that is probably common knowledge at this point, that there is that it is useful that both uh, introduction by, what are the terms we're using?
Introduction by proxying and introduction by shortening.
Right. Introduction by shortenings is sort of the default within the pet daemon anyway, for pet named paths and whatnot. But it is sometimes useful to do introduction by proxy if you wish the party you're sending the message to go through you when sending messages to the party that you're introducing.
Yes, yes, that's exactly what introduction by proxying is.
Yeah, and that's useful in some cases. Like you, if you do that, it's sort of like IP masking, right? You're able to enable. You're about to. Mark and I had a great conversation earlier about the difference between permission and authority. I'm going to just attempt to casually use these terms correctly. And uh, that if you pass something by shortening, you are giving you are the party that you're introducing, no, the party that becomes introduced, um, the third party, if you will.
Let's just use Alice, Bob, and Carol with the standard
Yeah.
diagram.
Yeah,
Right.
yeah.
Yeah, that's why I always go back to Alice, Bob, and Carol.
Alice, Bob, and Carol, right? Alice is sending a reference to Bob to Carol.
No, other way around.
No,
He's sending a message to Bob
about.
with Carol as an argument.
Well, that's why I don't do Alice, Bob, Carol. I
Well,
don't.
that's why
don't-
why you should.
So, supposing that Alice,
Sorry. Was anybody else coming into this meeting not already oriented about which role Alice, Bob, and Carol represent in the standard diagram?
You could consider me to be guilty of that.
I
Okay.
honestly thought they were equals.
No. No, Alice always sends a message to Bob with Carol as an argument.
yeah, that's not common knowledge.
It's every Granovetter diagram I've ever drawn.
Yeah, well, not everybody's drawn a Granovetter diagram. In any case, so which is to say that when we talk about Alice, Bob, and Carol, we should always preface it with Alice is introducing Bob to Carol, right?
Yes.
Okay, Alice is introducing Bob to Carol. And if Alice introduces Bob to Carol by shortening, Bob receives permission to communicate with Carol directly,
That is correct.
which reveals Carol's location in the world.
Yes.
It reveals their connection hints. It reveals reveals their public key, and a number of other things. Whereas if you introduce Bob to Carol, if you introduce Bob to Carol by proxy, you do none of those things.
That's right. And that's directly related to the issue of distributed identity and grant matching.
Right. And so if you introduce, right, and if you introduce by proxy, you do not get grant matching. Right.
That's correct.
Right. The
And that trade-off is fundamental.
It's also relevant to who you hold responsible for things not going right.
yes.
Do you guys, who here knows about Horton? Okay.
He heard a who.
Yeah, it's definitely named after that. Um, um, higher order responsibility tracking of objects on networks. It's a capability protocol for tracking responsibility, or to put it another way, in a non-identity based system. How do you hear a who? And I will send links, but the who here? Sorry, I've been assuming, who here has read my thesis? Okay. Okay, Horton is actually not in my thesis, but permission and authority, that is, like a central concept in my thesis that everything else hangs on. Okay. I will send around pointers to do more things and encourage people to read them. There's a whole, kind of paradigm with lots of elements that and how they relate to each other that I've done a lot of writing to put together, and we should all be kind of on the same page on all that.
I suppose one of the difficulties is how frequently I learn about my misunderstanding by being beaten over the head with a command line error message. This is the most common way that I learn about something.
How
Okay.
how did you arrive at this one? What was the error message? What were you
That's unfortunately yeah, that one is the way that I arrived at this one is just that we have an architecture in the OCAP kernel as well, doing these sorts of resolutions. Just want to be able to say accurately what it is that we've done. Um, and so one question that arises is like, do we enable delegation in some way? But this is a much broader term of maybe more of a legal term, although it does appear in object-oriented programming, of course. So unfortunately, there's no error that has prompted this question other than I couldn't find the boundary between these terms in my mind.
Sure. So I think that we've gotten a pretty good, well, I think that we're all on the same page with regard to introduction via proxying versus shortening. I think like delegation, we probably could dig into more.
Well, certainly in the law, as I've looked up delegation in the law, you have the delegator, the delegee or delegatee, and the obligé, right? The person for
Oh
whom
my God.
what
Go ahead.
the person for whom the a contract is being performed is the obligé, right? And so the one who hooks that person up to the delegatee is the delegator. And the word third party arises in the law to indicate some rights that the obligé might have in response to a contract that's made entirely between the delegator and the delegatee.
I'm wondering if the third party is the same party in the law as in CapTP.
Early these legal documents draw a random Venn diagram, right?
Right. That's an exercise for you, I think. If you were to draw a Granovetter diagram of the law and a Granovetter diagram of a three-party handoff, whether the terms line up or not, or how they line up, what is the correspondence? Maybe we can do that without a picture, but I doubt it. The um, these all seem to pertain to um, introduction by proxy, right?
Mm,
Or could it go either way?
I think it could go either way. The thing is, I don't think there's for the legal thing, delegator, delegatee, and obligé, that's really talking about purposes. And I think there are multiple ways to map those purposes onto object patterns. Um, and certainly the same use of the same object pattern will often be about different purposes. So I think that there's not you know, there's not a simple mapping between the two.
Mm-hmm. So we couldn't even name the delegator, delegatee, and obligé Alice, Bob, and Carol.
Not outside a specific scenario.
Yeah.
Referring to the general Granovetter picture now.
Yeah. Interesting. And then in object-oriented programming, a delegate is possibly like the words are related, but the concepts I don't think are.
What would you say it means in general object-oriented programming?
Well, the delegate pattern is very much like callbacks, except that you have distinguished methods on an object rather than a function. A delegate is um, often used in UI frameworks as essentially as a bag of callbacks.
Oh,
Yeah, a lot of these frameworks use the term delegate the way we would use historically use the word keeper.
okay. Keeper is somewhat wrong. It's only clearer to me because that's what the one I was exposed to first.
Concretely, while building out the familiar, a prototype of the familiar in Electron, Electron uses a delegate pattern for when you set up a web view, the WebKit view can be configured with a number of delegates. One of the delegates is for custom URL registration, and another one for navigation and a whole bunch of other things. It just essentially, it's very similar to an event emitter where the web view is going to call you back by calling methods of the delegate you provide and adjust its behavior accordingly. Yeah. Okay. Well, I don't think we got to the bottom of this. I think that there's at least a long blog comparing these somewhere in your future should you choose to accept it. Um,
I have a question or a couple of questions, which is in terms of introducing by shortening versus introducing by proxy. It seems like shortening makes sense to me as a default, and I think will obviously be more performant because like the final like communications topology is simpler and the path is shorter that messages have to travel. So introduction by proxy, you only really want to do introduction by proxy when the introducer wants to basically or potentially wants to like interject themselves and into the relationship and do something to the messages that are passing between Bob and Carol.
that's not strict
Yes.
proxying. It's an elaboration on proxying. Yeah.
but that's often the motivating reason why one would choose proxying in a system that does provide for shortening. I agree that shortening is much more naturally the default. Unfortunately for Agoric rather than Endo, we did not end up solving three-party handoff, and the reason is that is essentially the difficulty of naming a chain in a way that has the right security properties. A non-chain can just know a private key, and then you can name it by the corresponding public key or public key fingerprint. But software running on a chain can't know secrets. So we've done, so at Agoric, we have some special cases of three-party handoff, but we don't have an end-to-end three-party handoff capable fabric. And that's, and the result has been that we've accumulated kludge after kludge. Are we recording right now?
Yes.
I'll go ahead and say this one. No, actually, no. Yeah, let's go ahead and say it on the record. We've accumulated kludge after kludge, like the board, essentially because we're trying to make do with an object capability system that does not have end-to-end support for three-party handoff.
To need three-party handoff, you need to have like a product with multiple chains, which brings us to IBC. I don't like IBC has, as far as I know, when through IBC, when funds move between chains, the denominations get enveloped, right?
Mm-hmm.
And that,
yeah. So IBC, basically IBC has two levels or two components, two that are just sort of put together in the same protocol. One is the whole issue about assets, for which you're exactly right. And you can think of that enveloping as introduction by proxy.
right.
And then IBC just is sort of a TLS between blockchains, but without the notion of being able to send a TLS connection over a TLS connection. In other words, like TLS itself does not, but in TLS, in TLS, there is the notion of naming an endpoint securely, such that you can send that secure name over a TLS connection as information, and then the recipient can use it to forge a new TLS connection, matching the fundamental security constraint that Bob can be confident that the Carol he's talking to is the one that this is sort of the central integrity property of introduction by shortening, is that Bob can be confident that the Carol he's talking to is the one that Alice meant, and Carol can be confident that the Bob that is now able to send her messages is the one that Alice meant.
And there's also a confidence that if you've handed off that there's confidentiality, right? That messages sent through a shortened path are in the confidence between in Alice, Bob, Carol messages that are when Alice introduces Bob to Carol by a shortening, the result is that Alice and Bob are able to communicate confidentially without the possibility that Alice was eavesdropping, right?
So in the overall OCAP theory, and in the case of Endo running on non-chains, or any of these CAPTPs running on non-chains, what you're saying is exactly correct. Unfortunately, between conventional chains, there is no confidentiality,
Yeah, none at all.
including none at all, including of the messages going over other connections.
Because they're showing each other their ledgers.
Yeah, and all showing the world their ledgers, exactly. So it's important that the integrity story not depend on confidentiality and be intact by itself in a world with no confidentiality. But it's also important, of course, that we strive to build a world that also provides the confidentiality provided by capability theory, which conventional chains cannot.
All right. So thank you, Ryan, for bringing a question that improved, I think, all of our clarities about the subject material, except Mark. Mark's clarity was presumed.
Yes, thank you, Mark, for the response. Very helpful.
Good, good.
We've got a couple of minutes. I should probably share what I learned about permission and authority. The I think that the clearest explanation is to start with Mark, I think, identified that the clearest explanation is to talk about the distinction between permission and authority in terms of OCAPs in a local setting, right? The distinction is, and to be clear, what I learned is, among the things I learned is that the terms are confusing because they're like vernacular meanings do not correspond to their technical meanings. Um, a capability in a capability system, a capability and a permission are synonymous. And authority emerges from permission and behavior, right? So
Right.
the so that and therein lies the critical distinction that if you were to talk about it in terms of like named variables in a language are similar in spirit to a pet name, and they refer to a capability. So the referent is a capability. It's an object, and that itself is irrevocable. You can't once you've received an object, it can't be revoked. Its behavior can be revoked, but the reference is irrevocable. You have to drop it in order for it to in order to lose it.
Yeah. So the
Um,
example of a um, revocable forwarder, the caretaker pattern is, I think, always what I go to first for permission and authority. One of the historical criticisms of capabilities was that capabilities are not revocable. And that just really kind of makes clear what the confusions were historically between the paradigms, which is um, if Alice wants to give Bob revocable access to Carol, Alice just creates a proxy for Carol prime, whatever you want to call it, where Alice has a back channel to the proxy, where the proxy will start off just whatever message Bob sends to the proxy will then send to Carol. But that's a choice by the proxy. That's a choice by Carol prime. That's the behavior of the object. It's not given by the security foundations. So when Alice uses the back channel to tell Carol prime, stop forwarding messages, that hasn't changed the capability relationships. It's still the case that Bob has a reference, a capability to Carol prime, which Bob continues to have. Carol prime, let's say, continues to have a reference to Carol. At the point where Carol becomes irrelevant, Carol prime could drop it, but just to make the example really crisp, let's say that Carol prime does not drop the reference to Carol. Carol prime just stops forwarding because Alice told her not to. So the permissions graph was the same across the revocation access, but Bob's reference to Carol prime is now useless. You can't revoke it, but you've revoked its usefulness. So you've revoked the authority that Bob had to send messages to Carol. The authority was something that Bob had only depending on the permissions graph combined with the behavior of Carol prime.
So to loop this back to and apply it to our conversation with Ryan, if Alice introduces Bob to Carol by shortening, that is a transfer of a capability of an irrevocable permission, an
That's right.
irrevocable capability to communicate with Bob.
Right. So
Whereas-
all attenuation patterns are forms of introduction by proxy.
Right. So whereas if Alice introduces Bob to Carol by proxy, by a revocable proxy specifically, then the authority to communicate to Bob has passed, but the authority is revocable and
You mean the authority of Bob to communicate to Carol?
right.
Yeah, I think you're conflating authority to communicate with the object with authority to have the object do something for you. Because
Okay. That was my fault earlier in this conversation. I talked about the authority to send messages to Carol. It's really the authority to bring about whatever effects Bob could bring about by communicating to Carol. Because the authority is in terms of what effects you can cause, whether directly or indirectly.
Right.
right, because Carol might have a separate revocation facet that Bob continues to hold on to.
So,
And
so
the
some of the,
actual revocation would be happening inside Carol rather than inside Bob.
Okay.
no,
So
no. Hold on, wait. The revocation is happening inside Carol prime.
Right. I should say it's happening. Yes. Well, when you say when I said where the revocation is happening, I think that was ambiguous because there is the entity which is the causal agent to to change the switch from active to revoked, and then there is the realization of the revocation, which is when you try to perform an operation, it fails.
But it fails at Carol prime.
Yes.
Okay.
all right. Yeah.
By the way, one of my go-to examples for explaining this to people who are not immersed in the OCAP paradigm, but who are sort of more conventional is, and I use this in my long piece on my blog about what are capabilities, is the Unix password file, which is you do not have, you random user do not have the permission to change the password file, but you do have the authority to change the password file.
Mhm. Yep.
Because you can't like write to the file because you don't have write permission, but you can
And
change it by using the password command, which will change your password.
right, which is to say that it's closing over the behavior as well as the permission
That
graph.
is right. That is right.
Yeah.
It won't make just any change. It'll only make a specific change. And in fact, this is where a whole class of security bugs and failures and confused deputy problems arise, which is, can you fool it into making a change other than the one that it's supposed to make?
Yes. So why did I also introduce the term permission in the dichotomy of permission and authority when we already have the term capability? So once you're in the capability paradigm and you're only speaking capabilities, then you can just always say capability versus authority, and you're saying everything you would say by permission versus authority. So you don't need the extra term. The reason for the extra term is that the distinction between permission and authority is one that applies to all access control systems. So in an ACL system, what Chmod manipulates is permission. The entry in an access control list that says, for a given file, Carol, Bob may write this file, that entry is a permission. And an example of authority in an ACL system is, let's say on Unix, I run an FTP server where the FTP server actually is run as me, so it has permission to everything that I have, but I tell it to only serve out of a given subdirectory of mine, and then I enable Chris to talk to my FTP server. So the files in that subdirectory, Chris has no permission to. My FTP server has permission to, but Chris has authority to them depending on the behavior of the FTP server.
All right, we're a little over time. I'm glad we got to talk about this. Glad we got to put it on the record.
A
Yeah.
little overtime is how our people are.
mm, yeah, I'll call it at that. Thanks everyone.